Three, two, one. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Spare Change podcast. Today, some of the things I'll be covering include the economics of the war with Russia and Ukraine, how that has exacerbated existing issues to include global supply chain management and trade industries internationally between the US and other countries, and how it will impact not only those countries at large, but the people that live within them, and from every level at industrial down to average consumers, how the GDP growth slowing and interest increases that we've seen due to events such as COVID and the war with Russia and Ukraine will continue to impact us in the future, and what the way forward is and what our economy will look like in the coming years based on resources that I will begin to show you now. One of these resources that I am about to show you is going to be the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and that will come on screen shortly. So give me just a moment. Okay, so the International Monetary Fund has included within their research the global economy, advanced economies, and emerging market and developing economies. So within a scale, let's say that the US is a advanced economy and that Russia and Ukraine are both emerging market and developing economies. They play into the global economy. What you're looking at on screen now is a projection from the IMF discussing the slowing of GDP throughout all of these global economic situations that we've seen, i.e. COVID, trade restrictions between countries based on the war in Ukraine and other situations that are actively going on. And between last year, now, and next year, how the GDP of those economies will be affected by these events. So to dive deeper, we will look at the United States. Between 2021 and now, the GDP growth percent change and the projected growth percent change will see significant reduction by more than 50%. The same goes for countries like Europe, European countries. Asia overall, not as harsh of a cut, but still significant enough to produce unexpected change and numbers that will significantly influence economic development. And then you've got Latin America, probably the most significant punch on the board overall. They see more than, or just about, a 70% cut. I think these events are more than significant. I think they are economic impacts that will be sustained for probably decades at this point. We will dive into a list of countries and just as an idea of the economic impact, it is rather significant that war on top of a pandemic has influenced a market. So this slide might be a little confusing, but this is a resource from Yale rather than the previous resources from the International Monetary Fund. I thought this was interesting. So these are logos of companies, right? But then when we apply the background information as it relates to these logos and these companies have all pulled production resources and operations overall out of Russia. So Yale's article discusses how thousands of companies have pulled out of Russia and that the impact of this is slowing Russia's economy by upwards of 15%. And the sanctions on Russia will increase that slowing of their economy. Additionally, countries like Ukraine, Ukraine and Russia really, who are mass exporters in grain and cash crops throughout the world, and they provide significant resources globally. When they see impacts like this, and also the impacts of their daily actions in aggression and war in another country, and they're expending resources faster than they can produce them, it causes a slowdown globally on top of what we already had with COVID, which was supply chain mismanagement and an inability to keep up with a changing environment, where you have ships that are stuck in port for more than 75% longer than they would be otherwise. Now imagine if your trade route is blocked by warships, or your significant amounts of partnership and imports, exports, and the companies that were providing these resources, if they pull out because they don't agree with your actions, it will cause significant impact. But it might not be seen in just one area. A country like Russia will distribute this level of impact onto their trade partners, and their trade partners aren't limited to country X or country Y, it's global. And those impacts will be seen in the price of goods. They will be seen in the rate of interest on imported resources and exported resources. It is almost impossible to determine just by looking at sheer numbers where we're going to be. I'm going to drop the resources off of the screen for right now, but just the discussion that if we aren't able to receive and sell goods the way we were before, what is our next step? And for many industries and companies, it's just as simple as price increases. But it's not necessarily Russia or Ukraine that's going to see those effects. It's the folks globally that consume those goods. So when you look at things like a rising consumer price index and rising interest costs and rising cost of living overall, it's us everyday folks that are just trying to live our lives being impacted daily by things like, well, for instance, the pipeline in Germany that was supposed to be funded, but then the entire project was scrapped. That was the Nord 2 gas pipeline. And the idea that when conflict internationally slows trade and slows resources and causes significant impact to those at the lowest levels, how do we counteract that? So when talking economics of war, there are a lot of things to think about that I don't think people necessarily see. One thing that I want to highlight is economics is tied to everything. Economics has a social impact. Economics has an impact on the military. Economics has an impact in infrastructure, and economics has political impacts. So when you think of economics and finance being tied to things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, it's not necessarily all loans and debt and interest and banking, saving, investing. there are places money flows that we don't necessarily see. So overall, another resource that I wanted to highlight discusses the measurements of a country's gross domestic product. So when we look at this resource, talking about gross domestic product or GDP, it's measured in ways that you might not think about. So when you see changes in inventory levels, changes in investments, or the amount of money coming into or out of a country, and the consumption within the country and expenditures within the country, those concepts are what creates a country's status as either, like we had talked about earlier, an advanced economic situation where you've got a country like America or China who have already established their currencies in a global market and have established their trade and industry as the top providers globally, and they have fiat currency and they have an ability to liquidate large amounts of cash and flow it between all industries and investments that they have. It produces a higher rating for that country overall versus countries like Russia and Ukraine. They have a harder time. They're emerging market economies. Now, without diving too far into the weeds, there's a rating system in global economics. And these measurements, then you've got your, sorry if I skip around a lot of this is new to me as well. The idea that GDP can be measured in multiple ways. So gross value added, how much income is going above your output. So you're talking about like purchases that your expenditures are, and then you're talking about gross value added, so your industry and your sales and your international trade, as well as your government expenditures and the budget of your country. That's a way to measure your GDP as well. And then we'll scroll through the document slightly here. Talking about GDI, they utilize things like compensation of employees, taxes on production and imports, subsidies, net operating surplus, and consumption of fixed capital. That might not mean much to any of us, but when you're measuring the income of a nation against the income of other nations, you start to see where things pile up. So if we're seeing a global reduction in the overall GDP globally and the ability to grow globally, just from things like COVID or Russian aggression in Ukraine, the conversation starts to be much larger than, well, Russia's just going for a land grab. They want energy resources and they want to control Kiev. Well, what is Kiev? It is an economic hub for that entire country, that entire nation of people depend on that, as well as places like Chernobyl, where their energy resources, their nuclear energy, or their agricultural zones, all of these things are under attack. And then you realize that sends shockwaves through global economics, because Russia's attempt to pull in Ukraine's resources now affects global and international trade. When the US puts sanctions against Russia and reduces the overall value of the ruble to the point where folks in Russia no longer have the ability to sustain their way of living from before, it causes a massive exodus. And now people are moving across the globe to find new opportunities in new countries. This also includes movement of oligarchs from in and out of Russia. There's a company called Sayari, Sayari, and they do global analytics of data and then produce resources that analyze things like, for instance, they just did an analysis of Russian oligarchy and money moving in and out of Russia and Belarus and surrounding nations that are partnered with Russia. Those kinds of things are extremely important when analyzing a global market economy and understanding that the small things cause ripples and waves. So I think that we really have to look deeper when thinking about things that we just hear on the news and then we go about our day. So I am going to provide an additional resource in understanding. We will go back really quickly over that slide that I had up of all the countries that have left Russia or have pulled operations in Russia. Look at how many banks, look at how many financial institutions. We're talking Visa, MasterCard. We're talking basic point of sale that Russian people and Russia as a whole no longer have access to. Let's talk about social media. We've got Snapchat, TikTok, Twitter. Imagine you lose complete capability to communicate because of where you live. Like there are significant impacts, just mobility impacts as well. You've got issues with just getting gas or having transportation, cellular and telecommunications, those aspects of day-to-day social life and being able to talk to people that you care about, your family. It's not there. And when you think about that kind of pullout, well, how do you react to that? And this isn't just in Russia. There are multiple impacts from countries and companies partnered with Russia that are impacting Ukraine and the US. And global trade is really like under threat right now. And it's going to affect the bottom line of folks when looking into just day to day, like, oh, well, now because of sanctions or issues with Russia and they're an oil supplier, gas and electronics and anything that we get from countries, like we get things from China, semiconductors, and those power vehicles and phones. So everything eventually will get more expensive and you'll see interest rates go up and your country's economics might not keep up with that inflation. Things like the GDP in the US slumping by 50% is going to see significant limitations on growth as a country, and those limitations get passed down. So when a company can't afford to continue operations internationally, and then they increase the price of their product to the end user, it affects all of us. And that's one of the big points I'm trying to get after is this, no matter where you live, this is going to affect you 100%. So some of the resources that I use to discuss things today, like I had talked about, we've got the IMF. I use their e-library. Some of the articles specifically were the regional economic outlook for April 2022 over top of Europe, and then supply chains and port congestion around the world. Both of these are super good resources that I'll include the links to below. All right. I additionally want to have the article from Yale that I had pulled up to discuss the impacts of those companies pulling out of Russia and Ukraine and pulling out of the situation there. Those resources will also be included below. Another thing I want to talk about is the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, talked about pushing more resources and trying to work and build with Ukraine. These things also affect the day-to-day citizens of these countries. So when you look at these numbers, the US committing $7.3 billion since 2014 to assisting Ukraine with security measures, or March 15th, as recently as March 15th, President Biden signed an additional $13.6 billion in producing military resources, humanitarian aid, and economic assistance to Ukraine. Then we go on to, we're talking additional billions and new assistance and new measures to help Ukraine when they're dealing with Russia. All of these things, these expenditures, this taxpayer dollar is going to eventually come back, and the day-to-day baseline of finance and economics in America and other countries will be impacted 100%. I'm going to play a video from the IMF discussing how it relates to the bottom line, and what the way forward is and what our future might look like. So I really do think that the International Monetary Fund has put together a lot of solid research and data analytics into discussing the issues at hand: debt, inflation, global market, and international trade impacts, as well as potential ways forward from where we currently stand, knowing that the GDP will be reduced globally. Those impacts, I don't feel like a lot of people are talking about, but it is very important to prepare with families already struggling and people already failing to meet their daily needs. How do you tell them that it's only getting worse? That's going to be one of the big problems, I think, that everyone listening, including myself, is going to be facing within the next year or two, and potentially further out from that, seeing how the situation might develop when small actions take place. They're not limited to the places they're being talked about in. So I think it's always good to be aware of the situation internationally and how global economics impact us on a day-to-day level. I look forward to any conversation that might come out of this, as well as any discussion or future talks on the Spare Change podcast. I do appreciate you for listening. If you wouldn't mind, I would greatly appreciate it if you could share, follow, and continue to listen to things I have to say and things folks that I bring on have to say. Have a great day.